right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and we do have some groups joining us for the first time today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Now, I've been saying this all month long. I know it's a new month, and happy October, everybody. But I just want to say a huge thank you to all our teachers joining live on YouTube, wherever you're tuning in from. We know it's been a crazy 8 months of school or not school for all of you. And so it really means a lot that you're spending your first few weeks back with us as we continue to highlight amazing people and places. So today I'm really excited because we are building off this sort of mini series we did last year with some amazing scientists at the Arctic Institute of North America. And so we're joined today in Whitehorse, Yukon, one of the coolest places on the planet, literally and figuratively, by Dr. Matthew Ayre. So he is going to tell us today a little bit about why the Arctic is so important, highlighting some of his own work there, some cool research, and some solutions for how you guys can get involved to learn more and take action to help protect one of the most unique and amazing ecosystems on this planet. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Matt, and take us away.
Hello. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's great to see everyone across the country and even down in the States. It's brilliant. So I'm going to talk about what's so important about the Arctic in a climate change point of view. So I'm an Arctic climate scientist. I usually look at the Arctic in the past. So I look a couple of hundred years ago. But I'm going to talk more broadly about the Arctic itself because it's such a fascinating place. So first of all, where is the Arctic? So sometimes it gets confused with the Antarctic. So the Arctic is right on top of our planet, where the North Pole is. Yeah? And it's this big cold area. And then the Antarctic is the total opposite. It's at the south of our planet. The easiest way to tell the difference between them is polar bears live in the Arctic, penguins live in the Antarctic. They should never meet. Okay. Now, if a polar bear does meet a penguin, that's really bad news for the penguin because that penguin is going to become lunch fairly fast. Okay, so now we know where the Arctic is. Right on top of our planet. It's really important for our whole global climate system, but as an area itself, it's really unique. It has some of the coolest animals on the planet, certainly in my opinion. We have the bowhead whale here on the top left. That is the oldest living mammal on the planet. The bowhead whales can live over 250 years. It's crazy. Nobody knows how old they can actually live, but they're super old. We have the narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. We have these great big tusks. We have the beluga, the white whale. We have the Greenland shark. This is the oldest living vertebrate on the planet, so an animal with a spine. Well, there's been Greenland sharks that have been found to be over 500 years old. It's crazy. Yeah. And the reason some of the animals in the Arctic are so old is because it's so cold and they grow so slowly. But it's such a nutrient-rich environment, they can do that. Then, of course, we have the polar bear, which is one of my favorite animals. And there's a walrus here, which are big and stinky, but pretty cool to see. There's loads more unique animals. This is just a little overview of the cool things you can find there. But it's not just animals that live in the Arctic. There's people who have been living in the Arctic for thousands of years, well over 7,000 years. In Canada, we have the Inuit, who live across the north and into Greenland and Alaska. There's some Sami reindeers here from Sweden as well. But there's over 40 different groups of people that have been living in the Arctic and living traditional lifestyles for thousands of years. So the Arctic people and the Arctic animals, they all interact with one another in a big food web. So, the people rely on the animals for food, and the animals rely on the other animals to survive. But ultimately, they all rely on what is unique to the Arctic, which is the ice, the sea ice. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to talk about this in a climate change context. Now, you will have all heard of climate change and global warming. So scientists like myself that have been studying it, it's very clear that humans are having an impact on the environment through the burning of fossil fuels. Now, this started during the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago. And you can see on this graph on the left, as this blue line, as the number of CO2 emissions go up, so does the CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, it's a fairly simple relationship. The more CO2 you put into the sky, the more stays there. But this causes the atmosphere to warm up, the greenhouse effect. And we see this on the graph on the right, with global temperatures increasing as CO2 concentrations go up. But this is across the globe. This is average. So why is that important to the Arctic? There's lots of press talking about, how the Arctic is melting and how it's rapidly changing because of climate change, and this is all true. And because once you heat up ice, it starts to melt, and it's ice that's the real important thing in the Arctic, and it's the thing that's going to affect how the Arctic influences the rest of the planet and not just the people and animals that live there. But there's two types of ice in the Arctic. Okay, there's sea ice. Now this is frozen sea. So there's a sea that just gets cold enough to then eventually freeze. So seawater freezes at about -2 degrees Celsius. But then you also have glacial ice. This is freshwater ice. So this comes from the land, and they carve as icebergs from glaciers. So you can see in this picture on the right, we have an iceberg floating in front of the glacier it came from behind. But we also have ice sheets like the Greenland ice sheet as well. And this is all fresh water. You could drink this water, whereas you couldn't drink the seawater. And they have different impacts on the planet as they melt and as they change. So first, I'll talk briefly about glacial ice. So in the Arctic, there's thousands of glaciers around the Arctic, but there's one big ice sheet, and that basically covers all of Greenland. It's over 3,000 meters thick at its thickest point, and it's the biggest store of fresh water in the Northern Hemisphere. The other store of fresh water that's even bigger is Antarctica. Most of Antarctica is covered in a massive sheet of glacial ice. Now, you can see on this little map here, which is on air temperatures, you can see that Greenland's really warm. And when you heat up ice, it melts. And that water from that melting ice is going to go into the ocean. So it's the melting glacial ice and melting ice sheets that are going to cause sea levels to rise. Okay, now this isn't happening very fast in terms of relative, like when you can't go to the ocean one day and see it's higher than the next day because the ice sheets are melting, but you can, over time, this has an impact on the weather, where people live. Most of the world's population live on the coast. So I grew up on the coast in England. I now live in Calgary in Alberta. I'm just up in Whitehorse working, which is thousands of kilometers away from 1,000 kilometers away from the coast. But the majority of people live by the coast. So that's glacial ice. But what I really want to talk about is sea ice. And this is what I look at in my research. And this is what is it going to affect things I'll talk about around the planet. So sea ice is just frozen seawater. It's that simple. It gets cold, it freezes. So in the summer, when it's warmer, it shrinks. And then in the winter, when it's colder, it gets bigger. So you can see on the left, we have a summer extent in the Arctic. So this is looking right, this map is called a polar projection. And we're looking right down at the top of the planet here. So you can see the North Pole in the middle there and the ice around. So in the summer, we have this smaller extent when it's warmer. And then as it gets colder, as we get into winter, that sea ice extends. Okay, and it goes back and forwards with each year. Now, sea ice is really reflective. If you live anywhere where it gets really snowy or really icy, and you go outside on a winter's day and it's sunny, you have to put sunglasses on. Oh, sea ice reflects a lot of the sunlight. This is called the albedo. So sea ice has about an 85% albedo. So it reflects 85% of the sunlight that hits it, only absorbing about 15%. But the ocean, which is a dark blue, absorbs about 93% of the sun that hits it and only reflects about 7%. So this is why global warming becomes a problem in the Arctic, because if you heat up ice, it melts. And therefore, it exposes a little bit of ocean, a bit more ocean. That absorbs some more heat from the sun, which melts some more ice, which exposes some more ocean, which melts more ice. So we call this phenomena the Arctic amplification. And it's why the Arctic has warmed nearly 4 degrees since the Industrial Revolution, whereas the rest of the planet has only warmed 1. So, and we measure this, we've been measuring this since 1979. And there are other ways, and in my work, I look past this point, but we look from 1979, we first put satellites in space and we could look at the whole Arctic as one. And since we've been measuring that, the winter extent, which is in April, so how big the sea ice grows in the winter, and then the summer extent, which is how small it shrinks, have both been declining. So sea ice has been getting smaller and smaller and smaller every year since we've started to observe it. Now, this has all sorts of impacts. You know, the people that live in the Arctic rely on the sea ice for the food. The animals that live in the Arctic rely on the sea ice to survive. You know, a polar bear, while it's a bear, is classed as a marine mammal, and it hunts almost exclusively at sea on the sea ice. It hunts seals. So with less sea ice, it makes it harder to hunt, and that's why polar bear populations are declining. So I've got this video of the sea ice. Let's see if this plays. So this is the sea ice summer extent every year since we started recording it. And you see it changes year on year, but overall the extent starts to get smaller and smaller. So if you followed this line in this decline, then there are predictions that the Arctic will be ice-free during the summer months in possibly as early as 10 years' time. So that's no sea ice in the Arctic, which affects the animals and the people, but it also affects the rest of the planet. So we have the albedo, which I talked about, and the reflectivity of the ice. That acts like a giant mirror on top of the planet. It reflects solar radiation and manages how much heat we get from the sun, okay, which drives our whole planet. So if there's less ice, we're absorbing more heat and therefore getting hotter and getting less ice. So less sea ice is going to mean increased global temperatures. But the way sea ice forms as well also affects something called the thermohaline circulation. Okay, so thermo means heat, and then the haline is saline, which is salt. So, okay, this thermohaline circulation is this global circulation that transports heat and salt around the world's oceans. Okay, now for me, being from the UK, we're well aware of part of this circulation called the Gulf Stream, which is this hot surface current coming from the Caribbean near the equator all the way up to Europe. Okay. And it keeps Europe quite a temperate climate. But we don't get the winters that Canada get in Europe because of the heat transported up by this current. So where I'm from, which is only a little bit south of where I'm from, which is where I'm presenting from now, in the northeast of England, we would never get, or we'd very rarely get below 0 in the middle of winter. Whereas then I moved to Canada and suddenly it's -40 at the same latitude on the planet. And that's all because of this part of the Gulf Stream part of the thermohaline circulation. But how this relates to sea ice is as the hot water comes up and comes north past the UK and up towards Svalbard and Greenland, it starts to cool down because it gets colder, and eventually it begins to freeze. But when sea freezes and becomes sea ice, the salt drops out of it. So you can take a section, you can look at sea ice and you can cut it up and have a look, and you see these channels all the way through it. And these are brine channels. This is where the salt comes out. And you get this really cold, really salty, heavy water. And that sinks. So that becomes the downward part of this circulation. Okay, and we call that deep Atlantic deep water there. So it freezes, and then so this hot water comes up, it gets cold, it freezes, and then it sinks, and then it starts to make its way back down, all the way down to the Southern Ocean. And it goes, and you can see this whole circulation. So if there's no sea ice, if there's no sea freezing and no sea ice forming, then there's no deep water forming. So that breaks up this circulation. And if this circulation stops, then well, maybe this hot surface current to Europe will slow down because it's not part of this conveyor belt anymore. Which would make, so with the world heating and less sea ice forming, it could actually make Europe colder because it's not getting this heat from the Caribbean. Now, I said sea ice affects all of us, and it certainly does. So if you live in the Arctic, you rely on the sea ice for transport. During the winter, the land fast ice, so this is the sea ice which is attached to the land, becomes your highway. Okay, you can travel great distances to hunt, to visit family members and other communities, and generally to get around. As the sea ice starts to melt earlier or not freeze as thick, this becomes more dangerous. Okay. The lack of sea ice, as I already mentioned, affects the animals that live there and therefore the people that live there as well. Through finding food, they've all evolved to rely on this delicate ecosystem, which is now being disrupted. And then because there's less sea ice, there's more storms. More open water allows for more storms to develop, which increases coastal erosion, where there was never previously much wave action. Now there's a lot more, certainly on the north coast of Alaska would be the best example of that. And it's eating away at the soft ground, which forms the coastline there. And then there's permafrost. So permafrost is ground that is permanently frozen. And this covers the majority of the Arctic. But as the Arctic warms up, this permafrost thaws. And then you get these things. You see this road is all wobbly, and you get trees which are going over. But this affects the foundations of houses. So anyone who's built a house on permafrost, the house could start to fall down. And it makes it difficult to build roads and maintain roads because the ground's constantly changing as it gets softer. And then permafrost is full of methane, which is more potent warming gas than CO2. So as the permafrost thaws, we're getting more methane into the atmosphere, which is causing more warming. How it affects everyone else is the lack of sea ice has been linked to storminess in the mid-latitudes. So kind of southern Canada, Europe. When there's less sea ice, we see more storms. So this was a photo I took where I used to live a couple of summers ago before I moved to Canada. So what's happening in the Arctic can affect things way, way further south. But it's not necessarily all bad news, because with less sea ice in the Arctic, there is more opportunities within the Arctic certainly for shipping, if there's no sea ice across the Arctic Ocean, then shipping from the Atlantic to the Pacific becomes a lot quicker, a lot more efficient. We use a lot less emissions to trade goods between the two regions, rather than having to go through the Panama Canal in the middle of the Americas, or through through around Africa, or through the Mediterranean. So it cuts transport times by a month nearly. So there's a lot of people really interested in what opportunities the lack of sea ice will bring in terms of shipping. It makes access to the Arctic easier for tourism, which is a source of income for the people who live in the Arctic, should they want to engage with tourists. There are lots of natural resources in the Arctic, the use of which has brought us to the point where the Arctic is melting faster, but we need them to survive. We currently rely on oil as a global society to exist, and there is more oil in the Arctic. Whether we are trying to move away from oil, but there is the option there of more oil should we need it, and more gas. There are also interesting things being uncovered by melting ice. So retreating glaciers are uncovering new archaeological sites, so we can learn how people in the past lived. And the thawing permafrost, there are animals who have fallen in and died in amazing states of preservation that still have fur and skin and color to them. So we can learn a lot more about our past through this. And then I'm going to kind of conclude here in that there are lots of things we are doing are modifying the environment. But when we stop doing them, the environment tends to recover. So this is a picture of the ozone hole, which is actually over Antarctica, so on the south part of the planet. And this was caused by the production of chemicals called CFCs, which were used in fridges, mainly in refrigeration. But this was burning a hole in the atmosphere. So these were banned. And then as we stopped using them as a global society, the ozone hole has started to close up. And then this is another example of the community next to Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant that exploded in the Ukraine a number of decades ago. And the whole place had to be abandoned. But now it's a great example of how nature takes over and has come back. And the wildlife populations have returned and are more diverse than they were for a long, long time. So if we make positive decisions towards reducing our impact on the climate, so even things as simple as using a reusable water bottle or choosing to use public transport where possible, these have an impact and slow down some of the warming effects on the Arctic, which may give it a chance to recover. So I'm going to stop there and answer any questions.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ayre, thank you so much for such a neat talk. I must say, in the history of this broadcast, we haven't had anyone bring up Chernobyl as a positive success story for nature, which is really interesting. The ozone hole is something that we haven't covered in a while, and some of the positives of some of the potential positives of Arctic ice melting. So there's actually some really unique perspectives in this, which I really like. So I'm looking forward to diving into some questions from all our classes. We're going to go one by one through each class, so everyone's tech is working great. It's awesome. If you're joining us on YouTube, let me know where you're joining from. I'd love to hear about more classes coming in from across Canada and the US, and we'll take as many questions from there too as possible. But let's start with Robert Thirsk High School in Calgary, Alberta. If you guys want to come in, Mr. Lake's class,
questions
and kick us off with a question, go for it.
Figure one out. Okay. They're shy.
A high school that's shy? No way.
So I'll ask a question, Matt. You knew this question was coming anyways. So those that melting ice that's happening up there, can you explain to them how that's going to potentially change those currents? And you mentioned how England would get a little colder, but how's that going to affect the weather here in North America and our winters with those currents changing?
So with those currents changing, with the lack of ice, we're going to see a lot more extremes in North America. So we're going to see bigger, colder snowstorms. We're going to see hotter, drier periods in the summer. It's going to be less predictable as well. So our clear, defined seasons that we have in Calgary aren't necessarily going to be so clear and defined. This year, up in Yukon, I've been here for the last 2 months working at the Kluane Lake Research Station. It's been really wet. It's rained non-stop for 2 months, which is really unusual. Usually we have quite dry, sunny weather, a lot like Calgary. So the further north you go, the sooner you see these changes, but you do see them further south.
It's funny, when I was a kid, for our students that are coming up in school, whether you're middle school or high school, when I was a kid, everyone said, okay, climate change, it's a big issue. In 2050, we'll start seeing these big changes. And it's right now. We see fires taking over the entire west coast of Canada and the States and Australia. We see droughts in Africa. We see changes happening around the world in a big way. And that's a really great message to reinforce, is that climate change, more than anything else, will lead to a lot of unpredictable weather. All our models are predicting what's going to happen. All our expectations for what the weather is going to be like will be thrown in disarray. And that is pretty much a universal negative thing. It's something that we're going to have to really prepare for over the next few years and starting effective immediately. So I'm glad you mentioned a local story there as well, Matt. I want to go to the Keller crew in Hutchinson, Kansas. If you guys have a question for us, just demute your mic. All our groups can actually demute your microphone. None of you are in the broadcast right now, so please do. But Keller crew, take us away.
What is causing global warming?
Did you ask what has caused global warming?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else?
Oh, what was that, Jesse?
No, I didn't say anything.
Catch that.
I think we're set. What has caused global warming? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Matt?
Yeah, so global warming has been caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are fuels we find in the ground. So coal and oil and gas. And these release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a faster rate than would be natural through erosion. And that has forced the climate to get warmer.
Fantastic, guys. It's something that we cover in a lot of our broadcasts. In fact, we spend the entire month of April highlighting climate change, so you can check out some of our past talks too. But the science is really clear. It's been many, many decades that we've known this. You can look back to major documentaries in 1979 talking about climate change, the cause of it, research well back before that. I also want to stress, speaking of solutions, you mentioned CFCs in the ozone hole. If any students, especially high school students, want to see one of the coolest stories of like science put into action to make a positive good in the world, the CFC story literally has like heroes that saved millions of lives in science. It's a really, really cool story. So do check that out. Mr. Hancock, I'm going to go to Burlington, Ontario. Mr. Hancock's class joining us for the first time ever. So welcome in, guys. And if you have a question for us, go for it.
Oh, yes.
Hey.
I posted one on the chat, but I'll read out to you. Should there be major concerns for cities and towns? Hello?
Hello?
Hello. Should there be major concerns Should there be major concerns for cities and towns that are located on the coast because of flooding and the raising of the water or rising of the water?
So there are already small island communities in the Pacific which are worried about rising sea levels because they're so near sea level that even a small rise can cause storm surges to overrun the whole island. So we're already seeing concerns with the small rise in sea level we've seen so far. There's been 2 communities in Alaska, which again lived on the coast, which have been moved because of rising sea levels and increased storminess. Because if the sea level rises just a little bit, when you get a storm, that can create a storm surge, which can then access further in. Well, trying to find the words, can go along the land a lot further. So in terms of the bigger cities and the bigger populations. In London, again in the UK, I give a lot of examples from the UK because it's where I lived for most of my life. They have the Thames Barrier, which is already in place and already struggling to deal with spring tides and storm surges to stop central London flooding. So it is a real risk. If all the freshwater ice on Greenland was to melt, which is not going to happen for a long, long time, that would raise global temperatures by 6 meters, global sea levels by 6 meters. So yes, there is a risk. And lots of major cities and coastal cities and towns are already planning for this. Yep. But you're not going to get a huge rise in sea level in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. It's a slow and incremental process, but it's one we certainly have to prepare for and plan for.
Yeah. Matt, you keep touching upon all these great stories like the Thames Barrier, New Orleans, of course. We saw what happened with Hurricane Katrina and the levees there. The Netherlands is basically in a giant bowl, as is Bangladesh. So we have major population centers in the world that are going to be experiencing the major effects of climate change in the coming decades. So it absolutely is something to be concerned about and to worry about and to plan for to help mitigate the effects that are coming down the pipeline. So great question for Mr. Hancock's class. Let's go to Mr. Rob's class, joining us again in Calgary. It's, again, so many Alberta classes. I think it might be the record for most Alberta classes. So Mr. Lake, for your role in helping make that happen, I appreciate it. But Mr. Rob, come on in if you guys have a question.
I'll ask Lucas's question first. Yeah, so we got lots of questions, but Lucas from our class is wondering what kind of research you do up at Kluane Park at the research station there.
So I myself don't actually do any research out of the Kluane Lake Research Station. I'm one of the 2 managers there. So my colleague, who will be the next person to give the talk in this series, so Dr. Henry Penn, will be talking about his food security research. But we host loads of researchers from around the world, and our 2 main areas of research that happen out of the station are glaciology. So we're right by the St. Elias ice fields, which is the world's largest non-polar ice cap. So we have lots of glaciologists that study the glaciers there, how they're reacting to climate change. There's a couple of glaciers there that do things called surge. So they move really fast every decade or so. So trying to understand the mechanisms behind that. And then we have lots really long-term research into boreal mammals. So we have researchers there year-round who study snowshoe hares, squirrels, and lynxes. So they go out into the forest every day, and they're trapping these animals and measuring them, and then releasing them and tracking what they do. And they're figuring out how these animals interact and how they survive. The snowshoe hares, for example, they're cyclical in their population. So the population rises, it gets to a peak point about every 7 years, and then drops off. And then the predators, so the lynx that eat them, that follows on about 2 years behind. So there's lots of pretty interesting stuff happening there.
Yeah. Awesome. I just put on a banner in the bottom of the screen. If anyone wants to check out that amazing place in the world, just do check that out. Again, there it is for you guys if you want to look at it up after the broadcast. We're going to go to, in order, Ms. Jones, Ms. Thiessen, and Ms. Beavis's class. So welcome into all you guys. I've been loving the questions coming in. We'll share one on YouTube too, and then wrap up with another one from Mr. Lake's class. So Ms. Jones' class, come on in. You have a question for her?
Yeah, one of my students wants to know how much of the ice has actually melted due to climate change.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact number offhand, but it is in the tens of millions of square kilometers.
Which is an unfathomable amount. That's the thing with these volumes, is that when we talk about something, a lot of times when an ice sheet breaks off, we'll compare it to a state. So I know we've had ice sheets the size of Texas break off in the past, ice sheets the size of Rhode Island that break off in Antarctica. So these sort of volumes are incomprehensible, and it speaks to the scale of the problem. So great question, Ms. Jones. And by the way, Ms. Jones is joining us from Edmonton, Alberta, so welcome into that. I want to go to Ms. Thiessen's class now in Surrey, BC. Just demute your microphone, guys, and come on up. Hey. Oh, you got to demute your mic first. I can't do it from here. You have to do it on your end, unfortunately. So come on up and we'll be good to go. While you're doing that, again, Dr. Ayre has done a presentation with us in the past on our YouTube channel. You can check that out in the Mosaic Expedition, another great talk on climate change in the Arctic that we just did an hour ago. So Ms. Thiessen, it should just be the bottom of your screen, big microphone symbol. And I can come back to you guys in a second, actually. Let me go to Ms. Beavis's class, joining us in Peterborough, Ontario. So Ms. Group, welcome in.
Well, guys. What? Oh, no, we are.
Hey.
Sorry, our audio is down.
Oh,
Can't hear you guys.
Oh, okay. That's funny. We'll get it. Miss Thiessen's class, back again. Hey, guys. Now you're good to go.
Okay. We're trying, Jesse.
It wants to work.
Can you hear us now?
You're good. You're set. Yeah.
Okay, good. Go ahead, sir.
Yep.
How do we help?
How do you help? So
Yeah.
you can make loads of decisions that are really going to help. So you can use a reusable water bottle. So you're not buying, single-use plastic bottles. You can choose to use public transport if you need to go somewhere, if you can. You can, when you're older and you buy a car, you could choose to buy an electric car and not one that uses gas, which is fossil fuel. So it's all about making these conscientious decisions. And if everyone makes a little decision, it makes a really big impact.
I love that. And it's something that we reinforce in pretty much every broadcast we do. Sort of the central easy tenet to remember for everything that you're doing is don't waste, whether that's emissions, whether that's single-use plastic, food. All those decisions not only help mitigate climate change, but they help protect habitats. So basically, regardless of what you're doing as a classroom, as an individual student, if you're keen to help save wildlife, save wild places, don't waste is just a mantra that you can keep, and it'll really go a long way to helping make a serious difference. So thank you for some of those solutions again, Matt. That's fantastic. All right, I want to take the question from Ms. Beavis's class. You guys typed it in, which is awesome. Can a person live on an ice island, Matt?
You can. There have been research stations put on sea ice islands in the Arctic before to study what the ice is doing. But there's not a lot of resources there. You have to bring everything in. If you live in the Arctic, so the Inuit, for example, they're very comfortable on the ice. That's where a lot of the food comes from. So if I was going to live on an ice island, I definitely want some Inuit friends with me to help hunt. But I don't think I'd want to live on an ice island full time.
There's a message I didn't expect in today's broadcast. Speaking of houses, speaking of Arctic living, Miss Ardelian's class in Toronto, Ontario, kindergartners, they wanted to know what are houses in the Arctic made of, and are there many houses up there?
So most houses in the Arctic are built from wood. So they're all wood framed, and then they have a metal or a wood siding to them. This is because it's the lightest, most effective thing to bring up there. So there are no trees in the Arctic. Okay, trees don't grow in permafrost. So to get the materials to build a house, you have to ship them up. Okay? So traditionally, before we started building houses in the Arctic, people would live in tents in the summer made from sealskin. And then in the winter, they'd build houses. So sod houses, they'd use the turf from the tundra, and they'd build up a house, and then again with a sealskin roof. But now everyone lives in houses, but all these materials have to be brought up to the Arctic.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, we're gonna go to Ms. Beavis's class, but they just got their audio working. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask one live on camera, and then I'll go back to Robert Thirsk High School. And with that, we'll probably be done the live broadcast. So I will wrap up with a question with you, Matt, about how kids can ask more questions, because we've had more questions pour in than we can possibly answer in one live session. But let me go to Ms. Beavis's class. Come on in, guys. Oh, they disappeared. They were there and then they're gone. So Robert Thirsk High School, come on in. If you guys have a question for us now, go for it.
Hello. So what I was wondering was, what are the impacts of climate change to the flora? Like not just the Arctic flora, but also oceanic flora.
Yeah.
That is a great question. I am not a biologist, so I won't be able to answer it in depth. What you see in the Arctic, certainly, is you see the tree line moving north. So as the permafrost thaws, the trees can root, and you see those trees creeping further and further north, and you get more deciduous trees coming north into the boreal forest as well. And then with those, you get animals as well. So around Yukon, we're getting more deer coming up, and with the deer, we're getting more cougars, which you never used to have here.
Yeah.
So
cool. I'll want to highlight, because you mentioned not being a botanist. So we actually have had a botanist come on our program a few times. So Paul Sokolov, Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, has done some amazing presentations with us, talking specifically about climate change and Arctic flora. So check out those presentations, go to our YouTube channel, and you can find out more that way. I want to note, we can actually take this one a little bit longer, but this is sort of a special presentation set up. So what I'd love to do is we can go for another 20 minutes or so, if you're okay with that, Matt. Yes?
absolutely.
Cool. If there are any classes that have to go in the next few minutes, let me know in the chat bar right now. I'll make sure we get some of your questions in first. But I'll go to Mr. Rob's class right now if you have another query for us. Come on up.
Can I take my mask off? Okay, so I just have a question. We live near Banff National Park, and there's something called the Banff Paradox, where more tourists want to come, but they hurt the national park. But the parks were designed for protecting it. Anyways, I'm just wondering, with the Arctic melting and there being more tourists in them to see the Arctic, and it'll inevitably harm it more. I'm wondering if there's going to be what will the impact of tourism be on the Arctic? And with it being a fragile ecosystem, how can we prevent more people from coming up, who want to see it, from actually hurting it more, I guess, is my question.
That's a really good question.
That's a great question.
Yeah. So Arctic tourism is a real issue. Lots of people want to see it. You get this phenomena called last chance tourism. So there's all this press about the Arctic melting, and the polar bears becoming endangered, and this whole this ecosystem maybe disappearing in the future. So people want to see it now. So lots of people go up, and lots of people go via cruise ship, which poses a number of problems. Firstly, the Arctic seafloor isn't well charted. We have quite little understanding of the shape of the Arctic seafloor in detail, and because it's always covered in sea ice, and it's harder, it's been hard to access and hard to survey. But with less sea ice, we're getting more ships, and shipping is increasing. But with increasing shipping, there's increases in accidents. So if a ship runs aground, it could spill its fuel, which is going to be devastating to the local environment around there. And then, so that's an environmental impact. But also for the communities that live in there, they're very small subsistence-based communities, which can benefit greatly in terms of money from these tourists and these cruise ships coming in. But you might have a community of 300 people, and you get 1,500 people coming off a cruise ship and being in the community. It's kind of overwhelming. It kind of disrupts community life as well. So that there's a really delicate balance, and it's going to take some really tight regulations from a country perspective for each country to regulate the amount of tourists and make sure it's done in a safe and sustainable way.
Yeah. I love that question. So thank you so much to that student for asking that. It's one that we've almost never gotten in the history of this program. And I'd love to guide you to some examples of tourism done really, really well. So Rwanda and mountain gorillas, again, there was a huge threat to the ecosystem there and to the animals. And they've actually doubled in number because of the protections in place with sustainable tourism. The Galapagos is another fantastic example with certain numbers of ships allowed in certain areas at certain times. And it's very well regulated, has led to a big uptick in the economy there. And some other great solutions. And Costa Rica, which is one of the just gems of the world in terms of biodiversity, and has a huge proportion of its land set aside for nature preserves and national parks that are run really, really well. So check out Costa Rica, Galapagos, Rwanda for tourism done well. And on the opposite side of that, not that it's being done poorly, but there's a bigger threat. Iceland and Norway, and particularly with a boost after the Frozen movies, now get literally in some cases hundreds of thousands of people in towns with a few thousand, which, as Matt said, is incredibly overwhelming and can be very disruptive. So Banff is a great model too. I'm glad you brought that up, and we featured some presentations with Banff National Park on that topic. So keep on with that area of research and follow up and learn more, because it's a really, really cool topic and really important as the Arctic opens up. Great question, guys. All right, I want to go to the Keller crew. If you guys are still around, your camera's off, but Keller crew, Hutchinson, Kansas, if you guys are there, I'll see if you have a question. If not, I know some kids have to end their day. So you can let me know in the chat if you're still around. Ms. Jones's class in Edmonton, do you guys have another question for us? Just demute your mic and you're good to go. And then I'll come back to our high school classes.
Sorry, I keep forgetting that.
That's okay.
One of my students had a great question about how much of the ice could come back if we do some of the things that we need to do to make these changes.
That is a very good question. So, and it's a very long-term thing for the ice to come back and to get to levels it was before we started burning fossil fuels at the rate we've been burning them. Because of the positive feedback effect caused by Arctic amplification, so this lack of sea ice, more ocean, lack of sea ice, more ocean, and the increased heating we're getting, it's going to take a long time for the ice to regrow, I guess would be the best term. But the changes we can make now can stop it getting any worse.
Fantastic, guys. Great questions from everyone today. It's been really thoughtful discussion. All right, I'm going to go to Robert Thirsk High School again. If you guys have another one, Mr. Lake's class. In fact, you can ask 2 in a row if you'd like. Go for it. And if not, if Mr. Lake needs to come in, go.
Yeah, they have these questions and they apparently are mute when it comes to asking questions. Kind of a regular average day. So on that note, these guys are high school kids. They actually have futures outside of the pandemic here. At some point, they'll be able to pursue their passions. If they wanted to be involved in Arctic research or involved in some of this stuff, what are some of the doorways open to them so that they could actually come up and do some work in the north?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay. The first thing I would say is be interested in everything, okay? And always ask questions. I know you've been very quiet there, but asking questions is the best thing you can do. Okay? The route I took to get here is I went to university and I did an undergraduate degree in geography. And then that led me to an interest in climate change and to an interest in history, actually. So I did a PhD after that in something called historical climatology, which I can talk to you about another time. And there's also a recording of me doing a talk on my research in the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants archives. The best way, if you want to get up into Arctic research, then go down the university route. If you want to just come up to the Arctic and work in the north, there are numerous opportunities. There's the tourism sector, there's shipping, there's a lot of environmental work as well. There's also the natural resource sector as well. I would encourage everyone to come to the Arctic. Not all at the same time, of course. But yeah, it's a phenomenal place and it's well worth a visit.
Yeah. Fantastic. So many Canadians travel to the U.S. When they travel. Certainly, it's something that I did as a kid, and as I've gotten older, I've started experiencing Canada. It is an incredible place. So many diverse people, habitats, creatures, whatever you're interested in. So do check that out if you get a chance. It's an amazing opportunity. I want to share on the bottom of the screen too, and I'll share this to all our classes in an email as well. Matt's main chat with us on our YouTube channel. You can just type in his name on our YouTube channel as well on being a climate detective. And in partnership with his colleague Mike Maloney, highlighted expedition where through old whaling journals they found lost shipwrecks in the Arctic and went up with high-tech toys and tools and did scuba diving and all sorts of cool stuff. So check out those presentations, some really, really cool follow-ups to today's talk. I'm going to go back to Mr. Rob's class for one more, and if you guys want to wrap us up, go for it.
Sure. I guess my last question has to do with permafrost melting, and what are the models saying about gases released from permafrost melting and how that might impact climate change as well?
Yeah.
In terms of absolute model predictions, I'll have to get back to you. But the permafrost holds a lot of methane. I've seen videos of permafrost slumps in Siberia where someone's thrown a match in and it's been like a giant fireball comes out because of the amount of methane that's being released. And methane's about 4 times more potent in terms of a global warming gas than CO2. So again, we see this positive feedback effect in the release of warming gases and therefore the heating of the climate and therefore the thawing of more permafrost. It's, again, I don't have the absolute numbers as to how much gas is going to be released, but it's a process that's already happening.
And it's not good. There's a lot of, with Arctic and climate change talks, there's a lot of dire stories that you can tell, and you highlighted some of those today. I'm really glad you took the time to focus on some positive stories that are coming out of this as well, and some of the actions that kids can take at home. So whatever grade you're in, wherever you are in the world, there's lots of things that you can do to help this. And it starts with educating yourself, coming into talks like this, asking questions like Dr. Ayre said, learn more, check out our YouTube channel, check out research pages, and reach out to scientists and explorers. Most people will get back to you in a pretty friendly way. So always good to connect with people that you're interested in, and that'll go a long way to help inspire you on your own path to various careers. Matt, before we wrap up, is there any last message you'd like to share with classes today? This has been such a great talk.
Thank you for joining. It's been a pleasure to talk to everyone. Like Jesse said before, sometimes when we talk about the consequences of particularly Arctic climate change, it can seem quite dire. I would say don't lose positivity. There are sensible changes and choices we can make that and adaptations. So it's not all dire.
There's positivity out there. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining for the first talk. We're really excited to highlight more amazing chats from you, from colleagues over the next few weeks and months. What we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our classes, Mr. Rob and Mr. Late's class. You guys can join me in saying a big thank you and goodbye to Matt. Go for it. Thanks, guys, for joining in.